Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome. Wonderful to see all of you here tonight. I'm really excited about our speaker tonight, Jess Rao, the novelist and the author of his most recent collection of essays, White Flight's Race Fiction and the American Imagination. Jess is also the author of 2 short story collections titled The Train to Lo Wu and Nobody Ever Gets Lost. His novel, Your Face in Mind, I highly recommend to you. It's really an extraordinary book. It's been praised as smart, furious, brave, thought-provoking, and I really believe it is all of those things. His fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Plowshares, Granta, all kinds of periodicals, and it has been anthologized 3 times in the Best American Short Stories. He's won 2 Pushcart Prizes and a Penn O. Henry Award, and has received a number of fellowships, including a Guggenheim, an NEA Fellowship, and a Whiting Writers Award, as well as a Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant. I think that was for this book. Is that right? Yeah. In 2007, he was named a Best Young American Novelist by Granta, and he will have a conversation with Adrienne Brown. Adrienne is an associate professor in the Department of English. She specializes in American and African American cultural production in the 20th century with an emphasis on the history of perception as shaped by the built environment. With Valerie Smith, she co-edited the volume Race and Real Estate, an interdisciplinary collection that rethinks narratives of property and citizenship. Her book, The Black Skyscraper, Architecture and the Perception of Race, recovers the skyscraper's drastic effects not only on the shape of the city, but the racial sensorium of its residents, and it was awarded the Modernist Studies Association's First Book Prize. Her current research charts the impact of the U.S.'s move to mass homeownership in the 20th century on how Americans experienced residential space as a social, spatial, and most significantly, a racial unit. She's also working with Professor Bressert to collect and publish W.E.B. Du Bois's short fiction. So please join me in welcoming Adrienne and the conversation.
Thanks, Jess. That was really wonderful. I'm gonna instead of opening out, go ask you about a moment in that scene in the library, which I think is so interesting, and I really do love your reading of it. And the thing that resonates with me is that it's a library, it's a public space, it's an allegedly civic space, and it reminds me of the scene in Henry James's American Scene. I write about this in Black Skyscraper. He goes into the Boston Public Library and he's can't handle it. He starts wigging out because he's in this space of where penetralia is no longer possible because there's this civic body that's pulsing in and out. He can't represent it. It's all of this possibility of democracy and access and openness, and everybody lives in the library.
Panic.
Yeah, he's I don't know how to represent this. I got to go back to the closed door and the closed room. So I'm just thinking about the place of the library in that scene and how important it is as a container for Dillard to be able to kind of figure out how to contain it, right? Make it into a space of isolation. And just how different that is from a kind of scene of panic around the possibility of racial mixing in civic spaces that, happened 100 years prior. And not to call these scenes similar, but the way that the library produces a kind of explicit scene of racial panic that James has to shut down because he can't narrate it, and the way that Dillard has to find a way to narrate it by closing it down, right? And the way that race is part of both of those narratorial practices. I don't know. It's not really a question. That's more of I'm improvising.
But it's so interesting, isn't it, that Dillard, she writes about her discovery of these books in the library. And the experience of going to the library, she finds these things, but the library for her is this totally solitary space.
Yes.
And this happened again and again with writers that I encountered or often re-encountered in this book. I noticed how they were able to take urban spaces, public spaces that you think would be spaces where you would see a lot of people of different kinds. You would see a lot of different faces, and they would somehow make themselves the only person in that space. Jonathan Franzen is a total expert at this, and lots of it's really lots of 20th century white writers about the city. It's amazing how the city so easily becomes a solitary existential space for them instead of a space of multitude and plurality. You think about even the way that that Holden Caulfield experiences New York and Catcher in the Rye. You know, it's like, this is New York, you know, this is my New York, and I'm like the solitary person in the wilderness.
Yeah, I really like that, and I mean, I'm just thinking about James, where James is kind of like, I can't deal with this. I'm going to stay in my lane. And the ways that I think you're tracing a certain generation of writer finds a way to make it narratable by emptying it, right? That becomes the strategy for dealing with the civic space, rather than stepping back from the active narration, finding a way to conquer it through a selective kind of narration or something.
Right. And that, you know, also the intellectual aristocracy of James's era didn't exist.
Right.
You know, it wasn't reproduced in the same way in Annie Dillard's era.
Yeah.
You know.
I want to go back to the other, the part of your reading that's about the inadequacy of white innocence, and the way that Dillard is pointing to all the ways it's inadequate, even as she's holding on to a scene of white innocence. And I think the brilliance of your reading is to show all the ways that the text itself kind of suggests all the ways that whiteness is not innocent, or it's overrun by other forms of expressivity, right? And it just made me think about another work by Anne Chang that I just read like an hour ago, so it's like really fresh on my mind. It's a very short piece called The Wayward Life of Objects. And in this piece, what she says is that we often think about repressive ideology, colonialism, primitivism, Orientalism as repressive ideologies, right? And what she wants to do is kind of instead think about their absolute expressiveness. And then when you look for them, they're everywhere, rather than being repressed in something you have to like extract from the text. And I kind of see you reading in that spirit. So I don't know if you want to say more about the expressiveness that seems to be everywhere, that rather than, I think, the language of whiteness that we tend to want to use, which is a repression.
Right, repression and denial. But no, it's absolutely true. I mean, if you think about like so much of the white culture that so much of the white culture that I grew up with in the 1970s and 80s and 90s was so much about advertising its own falseness, its constructedness, its pathological quality, its unsupportability. You know, just like the phrase from the movie Heather is like, "What's your damage?" You know, it's like, just think about that. Like that's like a you know, sort of a common phrase in the culture. Like, what's your damage? At one point in the book, I say that like without knowing it in a racialized way, I feel like my whole upbringing as a punk kid, as a kid who was into underground music and stuff like that, was like all about this knowledge that like our generation was just completely fucked. That like, you know, that we were just like, we were in horrible shape, and like and something terrible had happened in the course of our, you know, youth and the way we were brought up in the 1970s. And, you know, in large part that's true. Something terrible happened, lots of terrible things had happened, but nobody wanted to like put the, you know, nobody wanted to quite identify what it was. It was just, you know, it was sort of like this, you know, this was the era of like Prozac Nation and all that kind of stuff. It was this advertising a kind of like pathological white oppressiveness. You know, that was, you know, you look at Kurt Cobain, and you look at any of the figures of that era, that's what they're advertising. And, you know, to me, it's like that, you know, that my assumption in this project is like, or my, you know, what I found in this project is like, it's not actually hard to sort of connect the dots back to whiteness. And I sort of wondered, like, why did nobody ever do it? Why did nobody ever notice it before, when you start thinking about like white depressive culture and all that stuff?
Yeah, I really loved your reading of the email, in particular on this, and I'm just going to quote you to yourself.
There's more tomorrow.
Okay, I don't want to give it all away, but maybe I'll quote one small line where you're talking about kind of white sadness and white blues, and email as a form of that. And this is from 233 in the book. Is it possible to turn the affect of white sadness into a form with an object, from sadness to sadness of doubt? This would mean turning the occult object of white hipster culture into the actual object of the lost address, the absent way of talking across the color line. It needs to be said at the same time what the white blues can never be: not historical, not epic, not nostalgic, not about loss. I really like that because I think in some ways, I mean, I just kept thinking about this is such a nice rebuttal, an interesting rebuttal to the idea of like first world problems, which often becomes coded as white people problems, right? As like a way you just need to get over your sadness, right? Your pain isn't that interesting compared to other people's pain. And I love the way that you're kind of saying, no, actually we need to sit with the pain and the sadness. And there's something epic and historical and about that sadness that's important in telling us something about race, desire, reparation, and its possibility or its impossibility.
Right.
So I wonder if you could say more about that.
Yeah. So there's this line that I put in the book from this band Sideshow that was a terrific, and very little known emo band in the mid '90s from Tulsa or someplace. Someplace in the Midwest. Yeah, someplace in the Midwest.
I'm sorry.
And so they have this line in the song, "Where did all you shattered people come from?" And to me, that's what my adolescence was. That's like the question. It's like, where did all these shattered people come from? And that, that question, that's like to me, that's like a very important indicator of a particularity of suffering and pain. They can't just be, that to me, like you can't leave that alone. You need to trace it back and understand, like, from a Buddhist perspective, like you need to understand like the karmic root in order to understand what's really going on. You need to understand why it's manifesting in these particular ways. You need to understand that by understanding where it came from. And like, as I say in this section, like I think it has a lot to do with racial melancholia. I don't think that's a very sophisticated or even novel idea, but I think that like the white racial melancholia that my friends and I experienced in the shadow of the golden age of hip hop was so self-evident and so chronic, in that era, that it just like it needs to be. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be thought about. Years ago, when Edwidge Danticat came to Princeton, this is what she was writing. She wrote this book about like the immigrant's life story. Mm-hmm. It was the Princeton lecture series. Mm-hmm. And this white undergrad raised, there were like 3,000 people in the room in this big chapel, and this white undergrad raised her hand and said, Ms. Danticat, like, your life has been full of like so much like suffering and pain and like Haitian culture and Haitian history, and like I feel like I don't have anything to write about because I don't have any like cultural roots of suffering and pain. And to her credit, Edwidge like maintained a totally straight face and was like you need to go back and find your cultural roots in suffering and pain. And she didn't say like, because I guarantee they're there. But that was, that's what she said. She said, don't think that you have to become a legit writer by writing about child soldiers in West Africa. Think about your own cultural roots of suffering and pain. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be the suffering and pain that your ancestors or parents or grandparents inflicted on other people. And that, that's okay. That's not only is that a valid subject matter, that's a crucial subject matter, for that particular person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really great. I actually remember that moment. You remember it much better than I do. I just happened to be teaching some of the precedents that Jess mentions in the book and talks about at length today, so they are fresh on my mind. And this is a quote from Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, which you talk about in the introduction as being a kind of important precursor to your text. And that really struck me in light of reading your book. And this is what she says on page 15. And this is, if you haven't been Playing in the Dark, it's Toni Morrison's. She gave it first as a series of 3 lectures at Princeton, and it's her reading of white American literature for the Africanist presence that she insists is everywhere across the literary canon, and does these beautiful, masterful readings of American literature. She says this in the opening, quote, "For the most part, the literature of the United States has taken as its concern the architecture of a new white man. if I am disenchanted by the indifference of literary criticism toward examining the range of that concern, I do have a lasting resort, the writers themselves. And she kind of goes to the writers themselves to reveal something that she finds lacking in literary criticism that wasn't able to do that work that she wants to see, right? She kind of says, the writers are going to help me. Writers themselves are going to help me figure this out. And it seems like, in some ways, you know, I feel you taking up that charge, right? The writers themselves, yeah. But also we're in a very different moment of literary criticism and critical race studies, right? From this moment that Morrison is talking about. I think really talking about literary criticism in this moment. Yeah. And I wonder how you are also kind of scripting a difference here, right? The ways that you invoke all kinds of different criticism and theory to help you read, and the way that they become your allies rather than Morrison's position here, where it's like I have to do the work that the literary critics aren't doing. And we're in a very different moment in the way that I think your book is both speaking with Morrison, but also marking a kind of different resources that writers might have to do the kind of work I see you both engaged with in terms of reading.
Yeah. I mean, Morrison. That's such a great question. You know, the thing about that book, I mean, she was giving the book Playing in the Dark, it's a series of lectures. It's for a general audience. And for whatever reason, I mean, that's probably just the reason by itself, is she had to keep them super short. She just used the primary text themselves. So she didn't talk about Hortense Spiller, she didn't talk about Henry Louis Gates, she didn't talk about any of the important critics of her own era, because she really wanted to go to the sources too, and I mean she wanted to go to the sources in a much more direct way, and I felt like this project had, partly I think just because I'm dealing with contemporary and near contemporary materials, and I wanted to sort of spread myself much more broadly than Playing in the Dark, where I'm not just writing about novels, basically I'm writing about lots of other things too. I wanted to go many different, lots of different places, and I'm also not Toni Morrison, so I can't, I can't do what she does and have everything sound perfect, so I need a little help from my friends like Sloterdijk and Derrida and people who usually make things much clearer. So I wanted to write I felt like I had to write a very different kind of. I do, there's one person that I always get up on stage and then I like blank on names, but there's a great essay by Leslie, Death of the American Fielder, thank you. Come Back to the Raft Again, Haqqani. It's this extremely important essay about white and black homoeroticism that came out in the late 1950s. And it's an absolutely essential work of cross-racial American literary criticism. And, I don't know, I'm sure she was aware of it. She should have gestured toward it because it would have been, it feels sort of wrong for her to leave Leslie. I mean, maybe he was a very unpleasant person, and maybe she just didn't want to, but I really wish she had engaged, because it's such a fascinating thing. Yeah. It's so out of its time as a essay in the late 1950s.
Just reread it. This may be so exciting as well. We'll move on very quickly. But just reading that essay or the book again recently, I just found so many places where she seems to be actively addressing literary critics and refusing to name them. Right? Yeah. There's this whole thing where I think she's speaking directly to Jameson and saying like, you have the political unconscious and I have the racial unconscious, but she never says him, right? Or Jameson is talking about reading as a Homeric battlefield, right? And Morrison talks about reading as a site of exploration but not conquest. Right? She's doing all of these moves to kind of think about a model of reading that's directly in conversation with these other methods for thinking about reading, but also being so canny and coy about not naming them. And I don't know why she does that, but
I find that really frustrating. I just find that really frustrating. Like Elaine Scarry does that all the time. On Beauty and Being Just, there's why are there no footnotes to that book? I mean, they ran out of money for paper or whatever? It's frustrating. That whole attitude of at a certain point in your career, you can just sort of coast over everything and not cite anybody. That just drives me bananas. That's just
yes, and I think
Elaine can do what she wants.
I think you talk about your own, the importance then of your own citational practice here, right?
I feel like, I always feel like I want to be very citational because I feel like that's good pedagogy. I feel like I want to say, to my students, like, to my students and my readers, like, this is where this comes from.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't make this shit up. And I also wasn't
You
the
can
first
find
person,
it.
excuse me, I know, I'm sorry, I'm shit seconds here. So, I didn't make it up, but also, like, I wasn't the first person who thought of this, and if you want to know more, you should go read this. Like, to me, that's just, like, the fundamental, it's part of, like, the trust between, between me and the reader.
Okay. Maybe I'll ask one more question and we'll open it up. And maybe this will be a good transition question to opening up. So thinking about pedagogy, which you talk about a little bit in the intro, and I really particularly related to what I see you describing as a kind of certain difficulty of teaching text and foregrounding the way that whiteness works in text in the classroom. Like I've had that exact experience when I'm teaching text about blackness. There's an expectation we're going to talk about race and representation, and that the text itself is foregrounding those questions, and then trying to switch to the text that's by a white writer, and having it being very difficult to have students think with this text in terms of how it's thinking about whiteness. And this is not to blame students. I think what you're saying and what I would also say is that it's not the fault of readers, right? It's the way that we're taught to read, right? There's something about the act of reading text by white writers and not thinking about whiteness. We're not given the vocabulary, although we don't have the muscle memory for doing that. And I think part of what your book is doing is like helping us to build that muscle memory, right? So I wonder if you could talk about how you do this in the classroom, both when you're teaching fiction or also when you're doing a work, when you're reading fiction or workshopping fiction, the ways that that this process can be pedagogical, and how you think about it as a pedagogical way of learning to read and teaching to read.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish I had like better sort of like one-pointed answers. I think that it has to do a lot with who's in the classroom. It has to do a lot with what kind of the interests of the students who are there. I find that once you start those conversations, they quickly take on a life of their own. Like once you draw your students' attention, you ask the students to talk about whiteness and the way something racialized materializes in the text. You actually don't have to do all that much work once you sort of just generate and give students the permission to have that conversation. I think I always think like the most important thing in the classroom is to generate a culture of just noticing, just basic attention to who's in the room, what's the structure of the conversation. Also, in a lot of cases, I think it's really important to point to what is the nature of the institution. So I teach in a predominantly white public liberal arts college in New Jersey that's immediately outside Trenton, which is a majority-minority, very impoverished city, and almost none of our students come from Trenton. Virtually all of our students are from the Jersey suburbs, and it's a very dominantly white institution. And so I feel like part of my job in the classroom is to draw my students' attention to the way that the institution that they are in militates against certain kind of reading. And if you look at someplace like the University of Chicago, that's take that and magnify it by 100,000 times. When everything about the nature of an institution like this, from the names on the buildings to the design of the buildings to everything, militates against noticing whiteness, naming whiteness, and talking about whiteness. So it's a kind of you have to think, and again, I'm definitely not the first person to come up with this idea, but you have to think counter-institutionally. And you just have to encourage a lot of exploration, a lot of sort of self-exploration about how did we get to this place? How did we get to be in this room in the first place? Sometimes the conversations, it's better when the conversations are about like the structures and the power dynamics that brought us to be in the room, before we can actually get to what's in the texts.
Great. All right, maybe we should just open up to questions.
I was really drawn in by what you said about where did all the shattered people come from to describe your generation. And I would also be inclined to use language such as that to describe my generation. The idea that there are so many people with so many mental health issues and the prevalence of pharmaceuticals in order to address those issues. And I was wondering if you'd say that people are more or less shattered now, if they're shattered for kind of the same reasons, like if you could speak to that a little bit.
I mean, there's really a continuity, I think. And it's interesting how these, this kind of, this sense, and there have been, people who have written about this, affect theorists have written about this specifically. This continuity over several generations of the assumption that white adolescence comes with depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, all these things. Like those things just live together. And it's sort of been passed on. And again, there's this fundamental. There's a lot more discussion about racial issues and mental health now than there was in the 1990s for sure. But there isn't a lot of asking of the kind of basic questions about how did the culture arrive at this point, and how is it that how is it that quote unquote American childhood and American adolescence has become so deeply self-mythologizing. I think a lot. I think it's really heartbreaking how much repression has been passed on from the Gen X, from my peers, people who are now in their 40s. How much repression and denial has been sort of passed down, generationally, in these very tidy, very beautiful suburbs. How much disinclination to face fundamental facts has and the kind of economic and social inequalities that go along with those things. How that there's just been so little self-recognition over the past 30 years. And you have a question?
My name is Kelly. I'm an undergrad, and as I'm going to my fourth year writing my BA, I'm thinking about Asianness and how it's usually kind of placed on on the spectrum between whiteness and blackness. Asianness is kind of in the middle. And I was wondering how you make narrative. You mentioned Dante Kao saying finding your own pain to write about. But I was wondering how do you write without creating a piece that lends itself to comparisons of pain, of saying my pain is worse than your pain, and how does privilege factor into that? Yeah,
great question. Terrific question. I can't answer it directly, except to say that that the conversation. There's so much critical conversation going on right now about anti-blackness and how anti-blackness functions as a kind of a hegemonic concept, and there's been so much scholarship and so much interesting analysis of the nature of personhood. Anne Chang is a great person on that subject, but there are many others, and a lot of it has to do with exactly the question that you're asking, which is what. I'm not even sure how to phrase the question. How do we avoid, because it's a central question about intersectionality, right? It's basically it's a question about is intersectionality actually possible, right? Intersectionality has become a buzzword, and everybody's all excited about it. And Amazon apparently has a music festival called Intersect in Vegas that everybody's very angry about. So you know that term has jumped the shark 100% when Amazon is sponsoring that music festival. It's like Kimberly Crenshaw, she's lawyering up big time. So the question of is intersectionality actually possible? There are a lot of people in critical race studies right now who basically say no, it's not. And that's, from my perspective, like that's a heartbreaking place to be politically, but it's a really, really interesting and long overdue conversation. And I'm sure your professors here can give you a lot of resources to, help you dig deeper into that. Yeah.
So this speaks to intersectionality and also what we were talking about, the sort of like the emo-ness, the suburban ennui. Because I also grew up in the suburb. I actually grew up in Towson. And so like, yeah, I went to Hopkins for undergrad. So you talking about the University of Chicago? And it's really interesting to hear you talk about also the element of repression in all of this, and the sort of like how you trace this all back to whiteness. Because I think in my when I was growing up, I grew up one of the emo kids too, and I guess I still am. And like when I was growing up, like emo like reached the zenith of the Black Parade. And I think there's a way in which you can trace a lot of, at least like 2000s emo-ness to queerness.
Sure.
And I think I've given a reading of the Black Parade where I think it's about being trans. And I'm wondering, especially when you're talking about repression and also about intersectionality, if there's a way in which there, I guess, this sort of passed down dissatisfaction. I wonder if it can't just be traced to whiteness, or it can be traced to other places in like equally as correct ways. And I wonder if you can take it all out and complicate your reading.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that that fascinates me about emo, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this tomorrow, is that it's a very extreme art form, and it involves this extreme foregrounding of the white male body for the most part, but in a way that is both or can be both androgynous, transracial in a way, or like questioning its own racialness, certainly questioning its own heterosexuality. Or even undoing its own heterosexuality, and even undoing its own being because of the really close relationship between emo and suicide, etc. Essentially, for me, I trace that back. I trace that from like, it goes from like emo to, like Baudelaire and Verlaine to Keats to Rilke, Goethe, and all the way back to Orpheus. It's like this male narcissistic self-immolation, self-abnegation. And then, the interesting thing about emo is because emo isn't like an esteemed art form. Nobody's like making gallery shows about it or anything. So it's just, it's a very democratic way of manifesting these very complicated and troubling archetypes in this space that only a few kids are ever paying attention to. So that's to me it has a kind of raw potentiality, in addition to also being extremely narcissistic and self-involved and reifying all kinds of oppressive behaviors, as it can sometimes do. But it's the sense of it's a kind of open space, for me, in which all these questions come up. This is what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. I'm going to talk about screaming and screamo, and the way in which the scream makes you question everything about the body and time and identity, because it's just like, when somebody's screaming, all those things are out the window.
Maybe I'll just add to that too. I mean, this is a very brief addition to think about your question about the ways that in the U.S. context at least, but I might just say generally, that the ways of the question of gender is always tied, and sexuality is always tied up to the question of racialization, right? And to think about the ways that it may not be a matter of saying and, but thinking about the way that those different ways of thinking about identity can have some sort of tie that's not about separating them out, but thinking about what the source and the relation between are. That makes sense. Yeah, sure. One more question?
I was just kind of on a totally different note. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Raymond Carver and Gordon Lish and the essay Beautiful Shame, where you talk about the kind of outsized effect of Lish's editing and the effects that it's had on the writing of fiction and nonfiction in the U.S. And I know that, Adrienne, you've also written on Raymond Carver and have thought a lot about him. So there's sort of like multiple ways to go with that, but I'd be interested to hear you both talk about both from kind of a craft perspective and then also his place like in the literary canon. And,
Yeah, so I have a chapter in here about where Raymond Carver plays a large role, and it's especially where I especially deal with is his relationship with Gordon Lish. And Gordon Lish is a very, really a very unique figure in his huge influence over American fiction in the 1970s and 80s and 90s especially. And the way that he developed what I think is a highly racialized way of writing that is extremely self-involved is not quite the word, but I mean Gordon Lish is an editor and a teacher and also a writer, but he exerted his influence as an editor at Esquire and then at Knopf, and also as a teacher. He taught many writers who are now very famous, and his discipline is the discipline of containing everything within the sentence and making the sentence a non-referential sentence. Now that sounds like gibberish when I just say it like that. He has to explain in more detail, but basically he's interested in like a kind of non-referential way of constructing prose and fiction that doesn't incorporate any sort of references to any kind of cultural context whatsoever. And for me, that is the perfect venue for a form of racial denial. That's what it becomes. It becomes this method of erasing race, erasing all sort of references or consciousness or awareness of race. And then it becomes, this is what Adrienne was talking about before, it becomes this way of advertising your own inability to communicate, which is exactly what Gordon Lish is after. What he says is like, not interested in communication, I don't want writers to communicate anything, I want them to just arrive. I want their sentences to just arrive. I want their sentences to just happen and not invoke anything, not remind you of anything. Which is very interesting, as an artistic practice. If he had just been like in a corner for 40 years, that would be one thing. But actually, he's the most influential editor and teacher in American creative writing in the fiction world over the last 40 years.
So my mid-century American white writer that starts with C is not Carver, it's Cheever. But I could say a little bit about that too, about why I write about Cheever so much, and have thought about Cheever a lot. I take my cues from this from James Baldwin's kind of interest in Cheever, and why he keeps going back to Cheever saying he really likes him, doesn't like Mailer. Like Updike, but Cheever is the one. I'm just like, that's my guy. And actually, this topic in your book makes me think a little bit about Cheever's emo-ness. There's actually something quite emo about Cheever that's different than Updike. Sure. It's different than a different kind of. Where it's just that messiness of that pain is just all over. Yeah. And it doesn't really make sense. It has nowhere to go, and yet it still keeps going and going and going, despite, I think, the construction of the work, right? It's just so. Anyways, kind of thinking about the ways that Cheever is distinct to me, taking my cues from Baldwin in terms of thinking about the messiness of whiteness and trying to think through the tropes of whiteness that were being remade in the 50s and 60s, rather than just reflecting them. That he was writing them and not just mirroring them or something.
Yeah, I mean, the other important thing about Cheever is that Cheever is a perfect example of somebody for whom white racialized melancholia leads immediately to substance abuse. Like those two things go hand in hand; they're not separable at all. So you can't the reflexive alcoholism of the suburbs, which is in some ways that's the subject of Cheever's work. It's like it's these people sort of essentially like sitting around in very fancy houses with very fancy pools and everything, and never quite being able to locate why they're so miserable and why they're just absolutely, shit-faced drunk all the time. That's the nature of the Shiva project, is withholding the actual name of that melancholia because it would be too painful. So Paley.
Thank you guys for coming.